And I think the American people respond to that sort of thing.
It's kind of an honesty then.
Oh, not kind of, it is an honesty. It's an upfront, whether he's right or wrong. That's okay. I mean, you can disagree with a man or a woman, but if they are at least upfront, they have the courage of their own convictions to say, this is the way I feel. I think we have a tendency to respect those people, whether in public life or private life or within our families.
Do you think it's the honesty that brings out the hero aspect?
Well, it's an element.
With us today, a man who has himself become a tradition with the Sierra Summer Festival, Mr. James Whitmore. In years past, you have performed Will Rogers. This year, you have a different approach.
Well, I do indeed. I've had 3 one-man shows: Theodore Roosevelt, Will Rogers, and Harry Truman. And I thought it would be interesting to take it more into a workshop situation instead of a theatrical presentation, and deal with those 3 men as I am permitted to by some knowledge of them, and try and find out what made them great and why they are considered to be, and I think, legitimately, American heroes. We need heroes. We have a hunger for heroes. All human beings do. Sometimes, unfortunately, we check out heroes and say, fine, without really knowing what we're getting into, and we latch on to a hero. Mankind has, unfortunately, from time to time, gone with heroes and followed heroes that have led them in very bad areas. I mean, the obvious and archetypical one would be Adolf Hitler, who certainly was a hero to a bulk of the German people, and led them, obviously, and the world into very destructive times. So that's what I'm going to do this year.
How do you feel these gentlemen became heroes for people today?
They, to begin with, had a great dedication, and I think the key is American heroes. They had a great dedication to what this country could be. Not necessarily what it was, but to what it could be, the promise of America to so many millions of people around the world. They also didn't have any great fascination with making money. Well, yeah, I don't know that it's that rare. You see, I think one of the problems perhaps is that we hear about and we see the money hungry, as Theodore Roosevelt referred to them, the greedy ones, and he called them also the malefactors of great wealth. We have a tendency to have them be much more evident to us. However, when you go into the cities and in the country too, you find an awful lot of people doing some marvelous work, human work with human beings, for no recompense to speak of at all. And so I think that we still have those people with us. I think it's a question of examining them, and that's why I think that the show could be interesting, to examine a person for his her or her qualifications for hero worship, and to examine them carefully before we give our hearts and minds and souls to them willy-nilly.
It's easier for a person to become a hero when looking back on their lives.
Indeed. No question. And we all know that writers and painters and people like that rarely achieve any great celebrity during their lifetimes, and it's too bad. It's a shame. But I think it's because it takes time to evaluate. Harry Truman, President Truman, is a classic example of that, because during his administrations he was a very controversial figure. And he had to make some very hard decisions. I suppose one of the hardest to make would have been the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And he paid the price for it, and firing Douglas MacArthur, who was a folk hero at the time. But then with the Nixon years, when we saw what was done, the manipulation and the terrible thing that was done to the presidency of the United States, and the lack of respect that it then gained from the American populace, guys like Harry Truman, who were dedicated to the presidency and what it stood for, and even though he may have made some grievous errors, and he certainly used very intemperate language, you know, I think one of the shocking things about President Nixon was that in public he used impeccable language in terms of obscenity. But then we found with the tapes that what went on behind the closed doors in the Oval Office was pretty yeasty language. But President Truman, on the other hand, used it
On and off.
but out front. He used it publicly. When he was talking to the press, his language was very often to Mrs. Truman's embarrassment with rather, yeasty language. And I think the American people respond to that sort of thing.
It's kind of an honesty then.
Oh, not kind of. It is an honesty. It's an upfront, whether he's right or wrong. That's okay. I mean, you can disagree with a man or a woman, but if they are at least up front, they have the courage of their own convictions to say, this is the way I feel. I think we have a tendency to respect those people, whether in public life or private life or within our families.
Do you think it's the honesty that brings out the hero aspect?
Well, it's an element, certainly, although we do know people that are honest people who would never qualify as heroes.
Right.
I think beyond honesty, there has to be a genius for perception of the truth and what is best for this country. And I think that and for the future, yes, and I think all three of those men did, certainly in different ways. Will Rogers did it with humor, which is a wonderful gift, and he did have the gift, and he was a genius in that regard. And he told the truth about our condition in America and the world, and he made people accept the truth. And I think the reason was that he did it with compassion. He never spoke from Mount Olympus down to people.
Right.
He always kind of classed himself, and he was, of course, a cowboy, as one of the people, and as confused as many people were.
Willing to admit that confusion.
Indeed.
sometimes.
All the time, yeah. He never placed himself above other people. Teddy Roosevelt, on the other hand, had a tendency to be a preacher. Teddy admittedly said that I want to preach. And he said that the White House is a bully pulpit. And I preach, and I love to be your weekday preacher. And the people responded to that because he didn't hide it, And of course, his own life was exemplary. His own life. Now, that's very important, it seems to me, that it's when we accept a hero and then we find that he or she has feet of clay. By that I mean that what they said was at total variance with what they were. And then I think a cynicism sets in, and very often a hatred. Very often I think the thing that many Americans feel about ex-President Nixon, which amounts to a hatred, I'm afraid. I think hatred is usually destructive, but nonetheless I think it was because they gave to him the highest office that we can afford in this land, and then for one reason or another, and I don't place the blame totally on him, but for many factors that I can't go into right now, they felt betrayed. And that's too bad, because when we give our love and we give our respect and our hero worship, if you will, to somebody, if they betray us, it's a tough thing. I think we've all had it happen personally, just one-to-one in private relationships, and it's a tough thing to deal with.
Don't you think, though, that it was, in a way, good for us to go through something like that, because it gave us an opportunity to reevaluate the office of the presidency?
Well, I don't know. When you meet crisis and you meet something that disturbs the status quo, I suppose it's always good. But one certainly would hope that we wouldn't have to go through that kind of a national trauma to reevaluate. I mean, the way the Congress behaved in the impeachment proceedings, I thought was impeccable. I really was very proud of our elected representatives, the way they functioned, responsibly and moderately, without any screaming, without any yelling, and so on. As it turned out, we had to face it, and we did face it. And I must say that the Europeans, I do a lot of traveling in Europe, and they were very admiring of us. They said it's an extraordinary thing. In many countries where they said if that sort of thing had happened, they say it happens all the time, the corruption. But they said it would have been, yes, in Europe, it would have been brushed under the rug and everything would have gone on as usual. Well, we didn't do that. We ferreted it out and we brought it to the attention of the public. Thank God we have the freedom of the media, though they oftentimes, go too far and so on. But so I suppose, having had to face it, that we handled it rather well.
Well, let us go on then with the heroes that you're bringing out. How would you feel that they have affected us locally here?
Oh, well, of course, Mr. Rogers lived in Santa Monica and had his ranch there, and it's still there for all to see, and I recommend it to parents to take their children because it does have an aura. And
Sunday afternoon.
You bet, or any afternoon, right. and the tour is lovely. He was a man of the soil, Rogers, and he then, of course, made motion pictures up through this Bishop area and in through this area. In those days, Mammoth didn't amount to anything. And so he was a part of this area and much beloved by many people who still, some of the old-timers, a neighbor of mine still has a saddle that belonged to Mr. Rogers. In profound ways, I suppose Theodore Roosevelt affected the entire western states of the United States most impactfully, and that was because he recognized that we had to conserve the things that we're sitting among right now. In fact, the camera can't see it, but over there is all federal land, and that was all made federal land during the administrations of Theodore Roosevelt. We have him and a man named Gifford Pinchot to thank for the fact that we have this land here unspoiled. Now, admittedly, we butt right up against it, and it's blessed that we could. But that was Roosevelt's impact. And then, of course, he created 5 national parks. It's hard to believe that in 7.5 years he was able to do and reverse a trend, incidentally, because the land speculators in those days, particularly the railroads, were trying to gobble up all of the western land and the right-of-ways and so on. And Teddy said no. The people, and for their children and their children's children, are going to want national parks, places where they can go and expand their spirits. And so he created 5 national parks. He increased our national forest acreage from 43 million to 194 million acres in 7.5 years. And this was against tremendous opposition from the land speculators, from the money hungry, as he said. And he also created 54 wildlife preserves. He created a Department of Forestry for the first time in the country's history at a cabinet level. And his impact was extraordinary on the West, all of the West.
How did you, as James Whitmore, draw in these 3 people into your performance?
Well, research, I suppose, mostly. I was kind of a Theodore Roosevelt fan and a buff, if you will. I had grown up in the East, and my mother worshipped, and I don't think it's too strong a word, she really worshipped the Roosevelts. His wife and the way they ran their family and their children, the way they were loyal to one another, the way they had fun. There was a great element of fun and joy in what they did. And so he was closer, or I was closer in my knowledge of Theodore Roosevelt than any of the other 2. Will Rogers, I had to research, I had to read and film. I had film available to me on President Truman, of course, and I went to the library in Independence, Missouri, where the archives are kept of all of Truman's administrations. It was just research and immersion in the men, trying to talk to people who had known them. And there are a lot of people alive that certainly knew President Truman. I met all of the cabinet that he had, the cabinet members in Washington, D.C., talked to them at great length. And then, of course, I must say that there's no such thing as a one-man show. I think it's very important to state that. There are so many other people involved, the writers, and I had some marvelous writers. I had some wonderful researchers, people that had a head start on me, that knew where to go to get all of the information. But I think the word would be immersion. Immersion in the life and times of the man and what he was.
When you research a character or characters as you have, is there anything that you have felt that if you had the opportunity to ask them that you would have liked to have brought that out?
Yes, indeed, it's very true. I, for example, would love to find out from Teddy Roosevelt why his first wife died in childbirth when they were both young, and it was their first child, and she died in childbirth in a house in New York, and his mother died on the same day in the same house. Terrible tragedy. But he never mentioned, in his autobiography, he never mentioned the name of his first wife. Never mentioned her name. He wrote a very small monograph at the time of her death that he sent to very intimate friends and to his family about Alice. That was her name. And of course the baby was Alice Roosevelt Longworth, you know, the rather famous curmudgeon in Washington who died recently in her 90s. But I'd like to ask him that. I'd like to deal, if I ever could and would have the temerity, to ask President Truman about the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Because, as you know, there's a controversy about was there a better way to do it, you know. So those would be the kinds of things. Will Rogers, I just like to have him talk. You know, I just love to hear him talk, and because he was such a wise man. So that sort of thing I would be interested in. How Teddy had the vision to know. You see, when you talk about Teddy Roosevelt, you're talking 80 years ago. You know, 80 years ago. And to have had the vision to know that this land, because at that time the population was, you know, a third of what it is today, to know at that time that we were going to run out of the beauty if we didn't mind our manners, if we didn't watch it. And of course it's a continuing fight, isn't it? I mean, right now we have a Secretary of Interior, Watt, you know, who seems to be saying once again, well, let's give it away. Let's let the speculators go in. Let them earn $1 on the national land. And I think we simply have to say no. But whether we will or not is another question.
Fascinating. Well, we thank you for this opportunity of being able to share with you.
Well, the pleasure is mine, and I would like to say one final word about the festival. I think it's mankind does some darn good things all the time. They often don't make the evening news. But the summer festival is one of the good things. I mean, the kind of thing that they want to do to get people together away from their TV sets, get them together in a beautiful situation where they can literally expand, as I said earlier, their spirits and their souls. Listen to music, listen to good music, listen to singers, listen to and see dance and so on. And it's a wonderful idea, and I just hope that it will prevail.
Thank you.